Welcome back for another deep dive with us today. We're going to be exploring something. Um, Misango, I think you'll find pretty interesting. It's why the Orthodox Christian Church practices this thing called closed communion. It means they have like these specific rules, thinko, about who can actually participate in their version of communion. So if you've ever, scanta been curious about like the different branches of Christianity out there. Or maybe like you're just fascinated by rituals and like the history behind them. Well, you're in the right place because this is a deep dive into a practice that honestly, Finko is often misunderstood. And our main guide for this whole exploration, it's going to be this blog post. It's from Orthodox Christian Tools. And I got to admit, Kinko, it gets pretty deep. I go like into all these theological terms. So to help us really unpack all this, Kinko, you've got expert speaker here. I'm curious, what's like the core idea here that sets the stage for this whole closed communion thing in the Orthodox tradition?
Well, it all comes down to really how the Orthodox Church views communion itself.
Yeah.
They don't see it as just some kind of symbolic act, but as like a literal partaking in the body and blood of Christ. It's the belief is that the bread and wine are like mystically transformed during their service, what they call the divine liturgy.
Okay, so that's definitely different from how some other denominations, how they approach communion, this mystical transformation concept. It really elevates communion to a whole other level, doesn't it?
Okay.
It's less about remembering and more about a real tangible experience.
Exactly. And because of this profound belief, the church, it has very specific guidelines about who can actually receive communion.
In the blog post, it actually uses this term, ecclesiastical unity, as like a reason for closed communion. Could you maybe explain what that even means in this context?
Yeah. So in essence, receiving communion in the Orthodox Church, it signifies like your agreement with their teachings, practices, and also their authority. It's really a communal act that kind of binds believers together under this like shared set of beliefs.
So it's almost like, I don't know, like joining a club or an organization, right? You need to like align with their rules and values to be considered a part of that group.
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it. Yeah. And it goes beyond just, agreeing on the doctrine.
Yeah.
It extends to like a shared commitment to their forms of worship, their traditions and their sacraments. From their perspective, allowing someone who hasn't made that full commitment to receive communion, it would contradict the meaning of the act itself.
Yeah. I'm starting to see how this ties into, that concept of spiritual integrity that the article keeps mentioning. Would it be fair to say then that for Orthodox Christians, someone who hasn't like fully embraced their faith might not approach communion with the same, with the same level of reverence and understanding, potentially, impacting its spiritual weight?
That's a very insightful observation, The Orthodox Church, it really emphasizes the importance of approaching communion with, the proper preparation and understanding.
Now, the article also kind of dives into this important thing called Apostolic Succession. What does that even mean, and how does it relate to communion?
So Apostolic Succession, it refers to this unbroken line of bishops, right? They can be traced all the way back to the original apostles of Christ. This lineage, it's considered essential for the validity of all the sacraments in the Orthodox Church, including communion. They believe that the sacraments are only fully realized, within this historical and spiritual framework.
That's fascinating. Do other Christian denominations have a similar concept, or is this unique to the Orthodox Church?
It's a great question, and it's one that often comes up, in these discussions about the different branches of Christianity. The idea of apostolic succession is most prominent in churches with, like an episcopal structure, like the Catholic Church, Movira, and some Anglican churches. But other denominations, got the different views, on the role of historical lineage in their practices.
To make sure I'm getting this, could you maybe illustrate how apostolic succession directly affects someone who wants to receive communion in the Orthodox Church?
Sure. So because non-Orthodox Christians don't fall within this unbroken line of apostolic succession, their participation in communion, Ren, according to Ren, to Orthodox belief, Ren carry the same spiritual weight, right? It's not about, excluding individuals, but about maintaining this historical and spiritual continuity of the faith, as they understand it.
So it's like their way of ensuring this direct link back to the source, so to speak, right?
Mm-hmm.
To maintain the authenticity and that power of the sacrament. The article also mentions this thing called canon law in relation to communion. Can you explain
Yeah.
what that is and how it kind of fits into all this?
Yeah, canon law essentially acts as like the rule book, right, of the Orthodox Church. It outlines the guidelines for various aspects of, church life, and it includes specific rules about who's actually eligible to receive communion. These rules aren't just arbitrary, they're rooted in centuries of tradition and theological understanding.
So these rules, they're meant to protect what the article calls the sanctity of the Eucharist, right? Can you maybe break down what that means and why it's so important?
Think of it this way, Birgit, if something's considered, incredibly sacred and holy, you handle it with the utmost care and respect, right? That's essentially what the Orthodox Church is doing with communion. The groshu, the canon law surrounding it, is a way of ensuring that the Eucharist is received with the proper reverence and understanding.
So for them, it's about maintaining the spiritual integrity of the act and making sure that nothing diminishes the profound meaning it holds for them.
Precisely. And that leads us to ardor, like the interesting point of tension that the article highlights, the relationship between, closed communion and efforts to build bridges between different Christian denominations, what's often called ecumenical dialogue.
Yeah, this is where it gets really complex. On one hand, the Orthodox Church is really committed to preserving, the purity of its own beliefs and practices. But on the other hand, there's this desire for greater unity and understanding within, the broader Christian community.
Yeah, it's a delicate balance, Antonio, and one that's not, without its challenges. The Orthodox Church, it is open to, dialogue and collaboration with other denominations, but it remains firm in its stance on communion.
I get the argument, for preserving tradition, but couldn't you also argue that closed communion that actually creates, unnecessary division within the broader Christian community?
That's a valid point, and it's a question that, many people grapple with. Some argue that a more, open approach to communion would be like a gesture of unity and inclusivity. Others maintain that upholding these, distinct practices, why it's important, that for preserving the unique identity and theological integrity of each denomination.
It seems like a classic dilemma, right? Navigating this tension between preserving tradition and fostering unity in such a diverse world. But we'll dive into that more in just a moment.
It's interesting, how perceptions of closed communion can be so different. Like what might seem like this rigid, outdated rule to some is actually like a deeply meaningful expression of faith for Orthodox Christians.
Yeah, it shows how important it is to understand the context and the motivation behind different religious practices. I mean, the blog post does say that, some people see closed communion as like a barrier to unity and understanding intimate between the different branches of Christianity.
Yeah, and that's a perspective worth considering, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we live in a world that's increasingly valuing, inclusivity and interfaith dialogues. So it's natural for some people to question a practice that might seem to create division. But the Orthodox Church would probably argue that true unity, it isn't about just ignoring differences or compromising one's core beliefs.
So it's more about finding ways to coexist and collaborate while still, honoring each tradition's unique identity and practices.
Exactly. Yeah. It's about recognizing that different denominations have evolved, along different paths. And they've developed their own interpretations and expressions of the Christian faith.
We've been talking a lot about spiritual integrity in relation to closed communion. Can you unpack that a bit? What does that mean in this specific context?
Sure. So for Orthodox Christians, it's about safeguarding, like the essence of what communion represents, right? Remember, they believe it's a literal partaking in the body and blood of Christ. It's a profound spiritual act that should be approached with the utmost reverence and understanding.
So it's kind of like protecting a precious heirloom, making sure it's handled carefully and with respect so that its value and meaning aren't diminished.
That's a great analogy, And for the Orthodox Church, opening up communion to those who haven't fully embraced their specific beliefs and practices, well, that would be a violation of that spiritual integrity. It's not about, judging individuals, but about upholding the sanctity of the sacrament itself.
I see. So it's like
Yeah.
this practice is deeply intertwined
Right.
with their entire worldview, right? It's not
Right.
just a rule. It reflects their fundamental beliefs about Christ, about the church, and about the meaning
Yeah.
of communion itself.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's crucial for outsiders to understand, Closed communion.
Yeah.
It isn't about being, unwelcoming or exclusive. It's about protecting.
Yeah.
Something they consider incredibly sacred and vital to their faith.
Okay, that makes sense. But are there ever any exceptions made, or is it a strict rule that's always enforced?
The Orthodox Church is generally very consistent
Mhm.
in its application of closed communion. However,
Right.
like any religious tradition, there's mother plot not. There can be situations
Uh-huh.
where pastoral sensitivity
Mm.
and individual circumstances are taken into account.
So there's a recognition that sometimes a more nuanced approach might be needed, even within the framework of this long-held tradition.
Yeah, for sure. It's important to remember that the Orthodox Church,
Mm-hmm.
it's made up of individuals,
Yeah.
each with their own, spiritual journey and their own set of circumstances. So while, the practice of closed communion is firmly rooted in their theology,
Mm-hmm.
there's also room for compassion and understanding in how it's applied.
Now that we've kind of gone over the historical and theological, underpinnings of closed communion, I'd like to get your perspective on its place in the modern world as we become, more and more interconnected, Livy, and as interfaith dialogue becomes more common. Merritt, do you see any possibility of the Orthodox Church changing its stance on this practice?
It's a complex question and one that sparks a lot of subject, discussion and debate within the Orthodox community itself. On the one hand, the church is very deeply rooted in tradition and change often comes slowly. But on the other hand, there's this growing awareness of the need to engage thoughtfully with the realities of the pluralistic world.
So while, Veritatis closed communion is a long-held practice with this deep theological significance, there's at least some internal reflection happening, right, about its implications in a world that's becoming increasingly diverse and interconnected.
Exactly, yeah. And that's an important point to emphasize. Even within traditions that might seem, unchanging. From an outsider's perspective, there are always, conversations and debates happening beneath the surface.
It's a reminder that religious communities aren't monolithic, right? They're made up of individuals who are constantly engaging with their faith in the context of their own lives and the changing world around them.
Absolutely. And those individual perspectives and experiences, they inevitably shape, the evolution of religious traditions over time, even the most ancient and deeply rooted ones.
Speaking of engaging with different perspectives, the article mentions that closed communion can actually create tension in interfaith settings.
Right. Just like an interfaith gathering where communion is offered. How might an Orthodox Christian navigate that situation while still respecting their own tradition and the sensitivities of others present?
Yeah, it's definitely a delicate situation. On one hand, there's that desire to participate in this shared act of faith and unity. But on the other hand, there's the commitment to upholding one's own beliefs and practices.
Exactly. And I think that's where, open and honest communication, it becomes so crucial. It's about being respectful of different perspectives, explaining one's own beliefs clearly and without judgment, and finding ways to engage in interfaith settings that honor, both shared values and distinct traditions.
So even in situations where a full agreement might not be possible, there's still room for, understanding and respect and a willingness to find common ground.
Absolutely. And I think, and that's ultimately what interfaith dialogue is all about, building these bridges of understanding, even across theological divides.
We've covered a lot of ground here, from the historical and theological foundations of closed communion to its place in the modern world and the challenges it can present. Before we wrap up, though, I want to circle back to something you said earlier about how perceptions of this practice can vary so widely.
Yeah, it's fascinating how a practice that holds such deep spiritual significance for one group can be viewed with with skepticism
I know.
or even disapproval
Right.
by others.
I'm struck by the importance of empathy and understanding in these types of conversations. It's so easy to, to judge or dismiss something we don't fully comprehend,
Right.
especially when it comes to, religious beliefs,
Yeah.
practices.
I completely agree. It's crucial to approach these conversations with a genuine desire to understand the why
Yeah.
behind the what, right? Like,
Yeah.
why is this practice so important to this particular community? What are the historical, theological, and cultural factors that have shaped it?
Right, right. And by asking those questions and
Yeah.
listening with an open mind, we can move beyond those simplistic judgments
Yeah.
and begin to appreciate
Hmm.
the richness and complexity of different faith traditions,
Yeah.
even when they differ from our own.
Exactly. And that kind of understanding, it's essential
Hmm.
for fostering, respectful and meaningful interfaith relationships
Yeah.
in an increasingly diverse world.
Well said. And I think that leads perfectly into the final thought I want to leave our listeners with.
Right.
If communion is meant to be, this unifying act, this symbol of shared faith and love, how can different Christian communities kind of find ways to bridge these divides while still respecting, their own unique traditions? It's a challenge, but I think it's one worth thinking about.
Yeah, it's a question that theologians and church leaders have, been wrestling with for centuries. And while there aren't any easy answers, the fact that the conversation is even happening, I think, is a positive sign, right? There are ongoing dialogues happening between Orthodox leaders and those from other denominations, trying to understand each other's perspectives and just explore, possibilities for greater unity.
So even amidst these long-held differences, there's still this desire for connection, this recognition that beneath all the complexities, there's this shared belief in Christ that kind of binds these communities together.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
And that shared belief, it can be a really powerful force for reconciliation and understanding. It can inspire compassion, empathy, and this willingness to work towards greater harmony, even if full agreement on every theological detail remains kind of elusive.
That's a hopeful thought to end on. So to recap our deep dive here, we've explored the Orthodox Church's practice of closed communion. We went into its historical roots, its theological underpinnings, and the reasons why it holds such an important place, in their faith. We've also, talked about the criticisms and the challenges this practice faces, especially in today's increasingly diverse and interconnected world.
And I think the main takeaway here is that this practice, it really isn't about exclusion or judgment. It's about preserving that sanctity and spiritual integrity of something that's just deeply sacred to Orthodox Christians.
Yeah, beautifully put. It's a reminder that sometimes the things that seem, the most divisive on the surface can actually stem from this place of profound reverence and just a deep commitment to one's faith.
Exactly. Yeah. And by taking the time to understand those motivations, we cultivate, greater empathy and respect, even when our own, beliefs and practices might differ.
A huge thank you to you, expert speaker, for guiding us through this fascinating and honestly complex topic. And to all of you listening out there, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this has given you a newfound appreciation for all the nuances of closed communion within the Orthodox Christian tradition. If you want to learn more, we've included links to the source material and some additional resources in the show notes. Keep those minds curious, and we'll catch you on our next deep dive.